Faith on the other, what did I do? Faith on the other hand, faith is a strong belief in God or the doctrines of religion. So all religions have some sort of doctrine, some sort of set forms of belief based on this spiritual apprehension rather than proof. So that we cannot prove any number of statements about any particular religion or faith, partly because that's what faith is. It's this belief in something that is spiritual, something greater than us, which cannot be proved. When we use the word faiths, however, we're speaking about the designation to one of the major religious bodies. And this is not a complete list, but at least it gives you an idea. So Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism are all faiths. That is, they all again have that element of faith itself and the understanding of religion, but they are different faiths within the broader definition of religion itself. Faith traditions, however, in the broadest sense, is the difference in the divisions that exist between one faith. So in Islam, you have a fundamental division between the Sunni and the Shia. There are other break-off groups within Islam, but in the Catholic, in Christian tradition, you have Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant. So you've got a variety of faith traditions. So often when I hear the news or read the paper, they'll speak about the Protestant faith. That's an inaccurate description. It's not really a faith because it is not a different religion from those who are Orthodox or Catholic. So faith tradition is the term we should use, not a different faith, because one is a Catholic, or one is a Protestant, or one is a Shia, or one is a Sunni. Shias and Sunnis are still Islamic by understanding, okay? So when we talk about religious diversity, let me say one other thing, sorry. In the narrower sense, there are patterns of worship or rite that distinguish one group from another. So you can have within Christianity, for example, a practice of having a traditional Latin Mass with incense and so on. You can also have a Christian tradition that has a band up front and has a very relaxed atmosphere. Those are okay. They are both worshiping in a Christian understanding within the Christian faith, but they have different rites and traditions. So as each group develops, they develop their own rites and rituals. And rituals are very important because rituals help define who we are. What we do in a ritual says a lot about what we believe. So, for example, let me just give you an example from Christian architecture in the Christian tradition. If you've got a very large church, which has a very, very big central pulpit high on the wall above at the back of the church, at the front of the church, very high on the wall, and a very, very small communion table. It says a lot about the fact that that tradition and that understanding is that it emphasizes the word of God as opposed to the celebration of the sacraments. So the rites and the rituals are slightly different. If you go into many churches today, the altar is the focal point. It's often very large, it's often very central. And the pulpit is often now just a lesser reading desk that is used to the side. So again, those rites and rituals are often defined by the architecture that we use. The image you've got in front of you here is prayer beads. Many traditions use prayer beads. Many religious faiths use prayer beads of different kinds. They might be praying different things, but they're using a ritual of praying those beads in some way, shape, or form, which is part of their religious practice, which helps engage them in the tradition itself. When people deviate over rites and rituals, that's often where you get lots of breaks crop up. For example, in the time of the Reformation, there were groups who wanted to do away with the practices and traditions of having statues, having a traditional mass, wearing vestments. Those are what we call the iconoclasts. That is, they wanted to destroy the icons that they perceived. When that happens, that helps to formulate a greater break the previous tradition. So the way in which we express our religious practices, it's often more difficult because it's compounded by these doing away with practices and traditions. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about religious diversity. We have to accept and recognize that in our modern times, we live in a religiously diverse world. That's a vast change from years ago when a culture and a religion were often synonymous. For example, take China and Confucianism. Propagated by Confucius, who lived from 551 to 479 before the Common Era, Confucianism laid the foundations for such much of Chinese culture and had a profound influence on Chinese society. So much so that when Christian missionaries arrived, they were persecuted for disrupting the culture and not the faith. It was that ingrained, Confucianism was that ingrained into the culture that the missionaries were accused of disrupting the culture, not the religion. We'll take America, which was by and large, this is a bit debatable at times, but was by and large Christian in its initial stages. After all, most of the, not many, perhaps I should say, many of the early immigrants came here to escape religious persecution. And when we saw the Great Awakenings, there were a series of Great Awakenings beginning in the late 1700s, sweep across the land, that defined the culture of America in its earliest days. We're seeing remnants of that now crop up here in the United States, where you have great arguments about Christian nationalism and the way in which our country was founded. But now, today, in 2024, almost every nation in the world is more religiously diverse, and Jamaica is no exception. So let's talk about diversity in Jamaica. Christianity is the dominant religion in Jamaica. I want you to go back and remember that I talked about the differences in religion, okay? So that is Christianity as opposed to Islam, as opposed to Hinduism, as opposed to Buddhism. Christianity is the dominant religion in Jamaica. And within Christianity, Protestant Christians account for 64.8% of the population of the country. By Protestant, I'm going to use in the broadest sense, that is Protestant, that is those who are not Roman Catholic or Orthodox. So Protestant Christianity is going to encompass all of the rest of the groups that make up those who are not Catholic or Protestant. In fact, in Jamaica, about only 2.2% of the population practice Roman Catholicism. Interestingly, by the way, if you are a Catholic, the Roman Catholics don't like to be called Roman Catholics. They are Catholic. Catholic coming from the largest understanding of the word universal. Other religions practiced in the country include Rastafarianism at 1.1%, Jehovah's Witnesses at 1.9%, and others. Now you notice that I've put Jehovah's Witness as a different religion. There are some within the mainline traditions of Christianity who do not accept the Jehovah's Witnesses to be truly Christian. So I listed it as a separate religion. A large proportion of the Jamaican population, about 21%, claim not to adhere to any religion. And 2.3% of the population doesn't specify anything regarding their religion. That is, they are what we would call today in our modern culture in the United States, nuns. That is, they belong to nothing. Not nuns with an O, not an N. Okay. So that gives you an idea of some of the diversity that exists within Jamaica. Christianity then was introduced into Jamaica in the form of Roman Catholicism, however. So that's important to recognize that while Roman Catholicism is now practiced by the least number of folks within the Christian traditions, it was introduced as the main form of religion. The Spanish settlers who arrived on the island in 1509 were the first to bring their religious culture to Jamaica. So it becomes obvious that if they were Spanish, they were Catholic, which has remained a Catholic country for many, many, many centuries. Of the indigenous peoples of Jamaica, primarily certain indigenous tribes, many of those died of disease or were killed upon the arrival of the Europeans. And when that happened, a large population of African slaves was then brought to work on the plantations established by the Europeans in the country. Most of those slaves later converted to the religious practices of their owners, and by and large, that was primarily Catholic. Later, however, when Baptists played an important role in the abolition of slavery, the Baptist tradition has had a long practice of doing that, the African population started favoring Protestantism over Catholicism, and soon the former became the religion of Jamaica. So historically, that's why we see that Protestant Christians account for a much larger part of the religious population. It goes back to some of those slaving days. The largest denomination today are the Seventh-day Adventist and Pentecostal churches. By Seventh-day Adventist and Pentecostal churches, many of these Pentecostal churches are the outcome of the Great Awakenings that I mentioned earlier, which swept across the United States. They resulted in the growth and birth of a number of religious traditions in Christianity here in the United States, which led to the development of groups known in some cases as Seventh-day Adventists, or indeed the whole Pentecostal tradition. Now we can really have some discussion about Pentecostalism going back, of course, to the very beginning of the Christian church with Pentecost itself. But the Pentecostal traditions are marked in certain ways by great emphasis upon the work of the Spirit, as opposed to even some of the work of Jesus Christ. Various other groups and denominations also exist in Jamaica, using the name of the Church of God, which is a smaller proportion, a very small proportion attend the Anglican Church, that is the church that came out of the Church of England. Ironically, of course, it was the Church of England, which was the island's only established church until 1870. And that means that when you're an established church, your church is considered to be the main form of religious expression. It's built into the Constitution. The American Constitution, of course, makes it very clear that there is no one religion that is favored over another. But I'm English, and so I come out of tradition where the state religion is the Church of England. In fact, if any of you watched the coronation of King Charles, you will know that he was not only crowned king, he was also marked as head of the Church of England in the same ceremony. There are smaller Protestant traditions within Jamaica, such as the Moravian Church and the United Church of Jamaica. There are some Quakers, and there are members of the United Church of Christ. So there are lots and lots of smaller groups. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is an ancient Christian tradition with a presence in Jamaica. The Ethiopian-style church building there is adorned with vibrant colors, intricate paintings, and traditional icons. So if you know anything about the Orthodox tradition, you know they very much favor the use of iconography, that is, images that are used to represent saints, Christ, and Mary. And so the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which is one of the branches of the Orthodox Church, has a special place there within the Jamaican tradition. Let me just talk for a moment about the Rastafari movement in Jamaica. And again, I'm not an expert on this area. This is some of the material that I gleaned from my own readings. It has become an important religious and cultural movement in Jamaica since the 1930s. And you're going to remember I was in school in the 60s, so college. And so we had at college often the steel bands, which came out of the religious part of this movement. It's been an important cultural movement as well within Jamaica since the 1930s, and has attracted adherents from some of the island's communities. It represents only a small population of the total population. There are some estimated 29,000 adherents to the Rastafari movement. That time, that is the 1930s, when it started up, the folks who were attracted were the descendants of those African slaves that we mentioned earlier, that the Europeans brought to the island. A section of this population started worshipping the emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie I, as God incarnate, and they began to believe in the eventual return of his exiled followers to Africa. So it's a tradition very much rooted in the cultural heritage of slavery itself. To these believers, the emperor was an incarnation of Jesus Christ. The Rastafari movement, though not hugely successful, gained a significant following in the country and elsewhere. Rastafarianism has become internationally known through its association with reggae music and some of Jamaica's most successful musical stars. So this is really a unique tradition that's existed, and it's particular, I think, very much to the life in Jamaica itself. Let's talk about some other religions practiced. As of 2011, there are about 8,000 adherents of the Baha'i faith in Jamaica. The Baha'i faith is quite different. They're a very ecumenical group. That is, they reach out to other faith traditions, other religious traditions. They're rooted in a spirit of peace and acceptance of all. Baha'i tradition has become quite widespread here in the United States. And there are a number of centers in various parts of the country. And I think it has now a significant following around the world. The Jewish community in Jamaica is one of the oldest in the Western Hemisphere. Jamaica also has a small Hindu population and a very small number of Muslims and Buddhists. Again, we can expect that because of what I mentioned earlier as the religious diversity of the nation itself. There are some religious movements that combine elements of both Christianity and West African traditions. We see this a lot that have cropped up over the last few decades, where you see a good blending of, particularly in the African traditions, a good blending of some of the music, for example, that takes place between the Christianity of the West as it was practiced and the Christianity of the East. So, for example, I went to a Catholic Mass some years ago where a friend of mine was was taking a final vows as a religious, and they had some sisters there from Nigeria. Those nuns came in dancing, which is part of their own culture and tradition. It's not something that I, as a good person who was raised a Catholic, would have seen or accepted in the West, but it was part of their tradition. So they incorporated that into the Mass itself. And so we see a lot of that taking place. Okay. So you see often rituals which come out of the tradition, like drumming and dancing and spirit possession, have been incorporated into the religious traditions that are practiced. Islam, let me just say a word about Islam for a second. Islam has a strong presence through the West African Moors who were sold to the slave trade. So again, part of the slaves that came over, they were already the Islamic faith, and they brought with them that faith to Jamaica. Today, roughly 5,000 Jamaicans identify with Islamic tradition. And the last count that I could find is that there are even 11 mosques across the island. Let's just speak for a moment about the religious freedom in Jamaica. Jamaica is very clear in its constitution that it provides for the freedom of religion, which is why I think you have such a diversity of traditions and faiths in Jamaica. In fact, discrimination on the basis of religion is prohibited by law. Now, we all know that that doesn't always happen in practice, but at least in the Constitution, discrimination on the basis of religion is prohibited by law. That leads to Jamaica being a host to a kaleidoscope of religious expressions that are really, again, highly influenced by its cultural heritage. We see so much of the culture of Jamaica being absorbed into the traditions of the religious faiths that are practiced there. And though the majority of the island's population is staunchly Christian, all religions, including Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and Rastafarianism, peacefully coexist with others in alliance with the island's motto, out of many, one people, which is not unlike the motto of the United States, out of many, one. So that gives you some idea, I hope, of the religious traditions and religious faith as it's practiced in Jamaica. And again, particularly, I hope you can appreciate the diversity that I've tried to point out, which is what Marie asked me to speak about specifically, the diversity of faith traditions and religious practices that exist within the island of Jamaica. Basically, the way I understand and see it is that if you go and live in Jamaica, if you are Jamaican, you have a very large choice of religions which to embrace. Now, obviously, as a member of the Christian clergy, I hold to my own particular tradition and understanding, but Jamaica has an amazingly vast array of folks that can live together with different religious traditions. If that can continue, that's a wonderful thing. We all know that part of the problem right now in our world is that religion is a divisive factor, so that it's problematic because it continues to provide an opportunity for people to express sometimes political gains based on a religious practice. So religion often becomes the means which divide people rather than unites people. I spent 5 years working in ecumenical ministry. The word ecumenical comes from the Greek word oikonomia, which means the whole household. And so I spent 5 years working in ecumenical ministry, where I came to really understand and appreciate just how important it is for people to be able to talk together, listen to each other, respect each other. We grow an appreciation of each other for their own religious practices. Sometimes folks in the ecumenical field would not do things the way I would do them. They would not hold to the beliefs as I would believe, but I do respect and understand their tradition. My 5 years of ecumenical ministry full time really taught me to do that, to listen and to respect. So I hope that gives you some idea again of some of the religious issues that are a reality in Jamaica. And I'd be very interested to know, particularly from those of you who live in Jamaica, whether some of that is on the mark or incorrect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paddy. So we'll be happy to take your questions and comments, as Paddy said, especially those who have lived and currently live in Jamaica.
You're muted,
Maxine. You're muted, Maxine.
Let me start off by congratulating you on your very comprehensive coverage. You know, every time I thought maybe you're going to miss somebody or it's one of our religions, you brought them all in at some point or other, because
Right.
you had mentioned the Jews earlier. And I said, but, we have really a strong tradition. And we have, as you put forward, a very old, because Jamaica started off being tolerant,
Yes.
and that is why the Jews were welcome
Right.
from as early as the Spanish occupation of Jamaica. But really comprehensive, I thought it was an excellent coverage of the religions, not just the major, the religions, the religious diversity of Jamaica. Peter, I could add something later on, but let me, I want other people to comment first.
Thank you, Maxine.
Yes, yeah, I thought it was very comprehensive as well in summarizing all of the different practices in Jamaica. And this might not be for this meeting itself, but I think it warrants maybe delving into some of these things later on, because there are so many different areas within the presentation that we could look at in more detail, right?
Yes.
Right.
One of the interesting facets for me was, given that Jamaicans mostly are descendants from enslaved Africans who came to Jamaica,
Right.
it would be kind of interesting for me to look at how, and you mentioned this partially, it would be interesting to look at how that element of Jamaica has impacted the different religions in Jamaica, right? How have the religions been adapted to the Jamaican culture, especially given that most of us are from enslaved Africans, yeah? So that,
Yeah.
I think, would be really interesting, and I'm going to be looking at that as well, a bit more. And another thing that has come to mind as well is, we talk about religions, and I'm wondering if there's a difference between, say, a religion and a practice, a life practice, a way of living. I don't know if there's a distinction between, both. Some will say Rastafarianism or Rastafari, for example, might not necessarily be a religion, but a way of life. And there are some others as well, what we call religions, that might be conceived or looked at as being practices rather than religion, ways of living. But again, these things have come to mind during your conversation, during your presentation. And
Well,
I'm gonna definitely be looking at some of this later on.
I think, Peter, you get some very interesting descriptions now. For example, in the United States today, many people would say they are spiritual, but they are not religious. That is, they have a belief in the moral order. They have a desire to do good in their society. They have a practice of following the commandments, even though they wouldn't call them that. That is their way of, very much according for us as Rotarians, as living the four-way test. And yet they don't want to join a church. They don't want to join a formal religious expression. And I think that we need to accept that that's a reality. That goes back to those folks who are called nuns, N-O-N-E-S. That is those who don't want to participate in any structured form of religion. So that is a reality we accept in our lives today. People are spiritual, but not religious. That is, they are not expressing that spirituality in a structured form of a religion. Okay. And again, to answer your first point, I think also you're absolutely right. I tried to point this out, perhaps didn't do a very good job at it. When the slaves came from West Africa, they came bringing some of their own traditions, which they incorporated into their practices that they adopted when they got here, because they became the same tradition, Catholic or Protestant, but became Christians by and large. But in the United States, though, for example, when the slaves became Christian because their masters were Christians, they adopted much of the language and the music that we know as the Negro spirituals, based on that Christian tradition. But they gave it different meanings. So when they talk about, for example, in the Negro spiritual, going over Jordan, they're not just talking about the Jordan River. They're talking about crossing back over, right, into freedom. It has a whole different connotation. And that, for them, many of them would have been the Ohio River in the United States, because then it marked the difference, marked the difference between the North and the South. So when they cross over the Jordan, they're crossing over the Ohio into freedom. So the religious practices express deeper meanings, but it comes out of that again, slave tradition.
Yeah.
I see Howard nodding, if you were in agreement.
Yes, totally in agreement. And I had some other thoughts as well. I also thought it was really a good presentation and very comprehensive. Just wanted to maybe add a few thoughts on particularly the Rastafarian movement.
Yep.
It's interesting because even within that group, they debate whether it's a religion or not. Because recently I've heard some of them saying we're not a religion, we're like an anti-establishment movement or a cultural movement with a spiritual core. So it's in some of them themselves don't consider it a religion as such, but they certainly, I think you alluded to that, they pull heavily on Christianity. In
Right.
fact, there's a large sect within Rastafarianism that call themselves the 12 tribes of Israel, as an example. There's quite a few others, but quite a few of their, their teachings have that spiritual core, or you may even say Christian core. So that's I wanted to mention that, and also that initially, even though it's true, I don't think there was ever discrimination in terms of them practicing their religion socially for a very long time. Maybe a little now, but certainly not as it was in the early days. They faced a lot of discrimination socially, couldn't get certain positions, jobs, even education. So I think the Jamaican society has come a long way in accepting Rastafarianism as a legitimate, cultural / religious choice
Well,
of persons
think
there.
we can argue about the place of Rastafarianism, but it has the core elements of
Yes.
religious identity. There's the core understanding. That is, it worships something,
Yep.
someone. It has a set of
Faith.
rituals and traditions.
Sure.
And so, even though you might argue about the specifics of this particular teaching within Rastafarianism, I think I would accept it as a religion.
Agreed.
Recognized religion, simply because I think that that's what it is.
Yeah.
It has all those standard sociological characteristics.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And I put it that way because one of my undergraduate degrees was in the sociology of religion. So when you look at religion sociologically and the place and value that it has in our cultures, Rastafarianism plays part of that, embodying perhaps more than other traditions the cultural understanding of Jamaica, as opposed to just an imposed religion on top of the culture.
Yep.
I would certainly agree with your comment, Paddy. And having come to know quite a few Rastafarians and become a very good friend of one who actually grew up, it wasn't imposed upon him. He didn't take it on for any other reason except his mom was, and she brought him up. But of course, as in everything else, his grandma was Christian, so there was a little bit of a tussle in his because he was raised by his grandma, but because she didn't agree with her daughter's way of living. But yes, I have learned through him that it is definitely, I would say it is a religion. You can see all the rituals, all this, I'm not sure of the exact terminology, but just what Paddy said in terms of what a religion is. But I just wanted to add a little bit, Peter, you brought up the whole thing that it would be lovely to have another session where we look more deeply into things. And the Baptist Church, which is now probably second to the Seventh-day Adventists, but remember, they came from the United States. It was Black preachers, George Lyle and some others, who brought the Baptist faith to Jamaica. But what many of those, even from in the States, as you mentioned, the Jordan River, etc., they certainly in Jamaica, they combined it with a lot of their own African tradition. And interestingly, I just indexed a book called Against Toleration, which is all about that Baptist, the growth of the Baptist church in Jamaica, but it focused more on the fact that the Anglican and the Catholic, they fought against the Baptists initially because there were factions which were so African. They had really, the enslaved really injected. There was the drumming, there was the dancing, and then there were two factions which were even called Shakerism because of the dancing, and Shouterism because of the drumming and the singing. So this book was so fascinating because it was how both sides had to compromise, and it was only as recently as the 1960s that, you know, things were really the stigma against those practices in the Baptist church, but were sort of more accepted and maybe toned down to some extent to be able to be accepted. But it is, religion in Jamaica is fascinating.
Yeah.
And although I was brought up as an Anglican myself, and I still, you know, I'm very conservative in what I consider worship, I've realized, you know, I am becoming more open, certainly, to seeing what others are like. So it's an interesting period. This came at a most interesting point in my life because I am looking to embrace diversity.
Thank you, Maxine. Thank you. I want to bring this to a close. We only have 5 minutes